Before we read our text for this morning, there are a couple of background issues that we need to deal with. Some have suggested that in the couple of verses we're going to read together at the beginning of the second chapter of Luke's Gospel, that there are historical inaccuracies. Luke has established in chapter 1 that Mary lived in a little village called Nazareth, which also appears to have been the hometown of Joseph, her fiancé. As Luke begins the second chapter of his gospel, he is going to tell us that in the final months of Mary's pregnancy with Jesus, the Roman Emperor Caesar Augustus issued a decree that forced everyone in the empire to travel to their hometown to register in a census. And this is in fact what brings the Holy Family from Nazareth to Bethlehem, the ancestral home of King David and of Joseph and his lineage, just in time for Jesus to be born where the prophet said he would be born. So it's key that Joseph and Mary travel from Nazareth to Bethlehem. Luke chapter 2 begins this way in verse 1. In those days a decree went out from Caesar Augustus that all the world should be registered. This was the first registration when Quirinius was governor of Syria. And all went to be registered, each to his hometown. And Joseph also went up from Galilee, from the town of Nazareth to Judea, to the city of David, which is called Bethlehem, because he was of the house and lineage of David. Now, the first problem that some have with the text is that we do not have any historical evidence of the Roman emperors ever decreeing a census that required everyone across the whole Roman Empire to travel to the town of their birth. There were some censuses of the whole empire. And there were some local censuses that required people to register in their hometowns, but those seem to be two different kinds of censuses. There is no record in the historical books of an empire-wide census that at the same time required everyone to travel home to their home village. Just imagine what it would be like, given the high number of immigrants among us here in Canada and the number of us who travel, if every 10 years when the government required the census, you not only had to fill out the form that came on the mail or that came as an email, but on top of that you had to travel back to the city where you were born. Imagine the chaos. Now the response to this first challenge is straightforward. There were indeed moments when the population of the entire Roman Empire was tabulated. That's not in question. The Roman emperors liked to know how many people they governed. In most of the territories they governed, they were particularly interested in knowing not only how many people they ruled, but they also wanted to know exactly how many able-bodied young men were there who could be conscripted by force into the imperial army if they decided to wage a war. So the emperors were fastidious about keeping these numbers. One of the leading Roman historians, a man by the name of Tacitus, tells us that Octavian, the actual name of Augustus Caesar that Luke introduces to us at the beginning of chapter 2, Octavian was a little obsessive-compulsive about the census, in fact, and he liked to get the reports from the different territories, and then he tabulated them himself. Nobody else was allowed to run the grand total. All of the reports would come from all of the different provinces and territory. They would come in his office, and with great pomp, he himself would take out his pencil or his quill, and he would run the tabulations himself. He was apparently a bit of a mathematician. Now, in some ways, the territory of Judea was a little unusual. For a variety of religious reasons, they had been exempted from military duty. But the emperors didn't just register the masses to know how many young men they could count on in case they went to war. The registry roll was also used for taxation. And tax they did again and again and again. Now, the first apparent problem we have with the census Luke mentions is not that these empire-wide censuses didn't occur. They didn't. The problem is that the empire-wide decrees that we know of didn't force everyone across the empire to register to their hometown. Now, even as I point out the issue that's raised by the critics, I need to underline that it's very difficult to argue something from silence. The fact that historians don't mention something doesn't mean that it didn't happen or that it couldn't have happened. It's not as if the record told us that there was a decree or a law or rule that this particular kind of census was never to be taken. What we have is an absence. This kind of worldwide census with everybody registering in their hometown is never specifically mentioned. That's not quite the same as if it was contradicting the official record. Let me take an example. If some new historian wrote a book suddenly and claimed that Hitler was a blonde-haired, blue-eyed Spanish immigrant, well, we can prove that's wrong from the record. We know that's not right. We know where Hitler was born. We know he didn't speak Spanish. We know he didn't have blonde hair. And we know that he didn't have blue eyes. We can disprove that by the historical record. But suppose a historian told us that Hitler was a whiz at playing Scrabble. Well, that fact's not mentioned anywhere. We're not told anywhere that he didn't play Scrabble. Scrabble was first produced in the U.S. in the 1930s, and within a couple of years, it had found its way to Europe, and it existed in a German form in time for Hitler maybe to have played Scrabble. So, well, maybe Hitler could have played Scrabble. We don't know. We can't tell. It's hard to prove something from silence. Now, we do know that when official decrees were given, sometimes they were adjusted for the local reality. Let me give you my favorite example. When Pontius Pilate enters Jerusalem on his first day of work as the new governor, he followed the official policy that applied everywhere else in the empire. On the first day, when you walk into the capital city of a new province as the governor, you need to make a show of force. And so on your first day, with all of your guard, you would walk in with the military ensign of Rome, with the eagle, with the shield that bore the emperor's image. This is what you did on your first day as a governor in every other province except in Judea. These images were offensive to the Jews. And so there was an allowance. Anywhere else, when the governor started his first day on the job, you could come in with the Roman eagle, with the ensigns of the emperor. That was allowed, but you didn't do that in Judea. It was just offensive. You held back. You adjusted the official empire-wide reality. Now, Pilate refused to listen to reason. He came barging into Jerusalem with the Roman eagles on the posts, with the ensigns of the emperor and of himself. And when he realized he made the people mad, he wanted to push the point, he actually took the ensign of the emperor and he mounted them on the walls of the temple in Jerusalem. There was an uproar, and they sent the first complaint letter to the emperor about Pontius Pilate. It was the first time he got his finger slapped, and it wouldn't be the last. Now, we know from the records that the census decree is another one of those decrees that was adjusted regionally. Since Jewish men were exempt from military service, for instance, there was little point in going through the trouble and expense of counting the number of eligible fighting men that were there in Judea. So when the emperor took the census across the country, in every other province they counted the military men. They didn't do that in Judea. There was no point. So we know that when the empire-wide census is given, it was applied a little differently in Judea. We'll mention it in a moment. But we do have at least one historical case where a local governor in the area of Israel imposed a compulsory registration in their hometown for Jews as part of a wider census, and it didn't go well. And it's also possible to read the first few verses of Luke chapter 2 in such a way that we understand that there was an emperor-wide census and that for some reasons in Judea they decided that everyone should travel home to their hometown. That would bring Joseph back to Bethlehem in the wider census, which would fit with the historical records we have. But the question then becomes, okay, that brings Joseph to Bethlehem. What about Mary? Why does Mary make the trip? It's Joseph who had to sign up in the hometown of his ancestors. Well, there's a couple of possibilities. There's actually two censuses that we found that required the women to travel and register as well, not just the head of the family. That might have happened. And maybe Mary wanted to be with Joseph. She's not married, she doesn't have a husband, she's pregnant, she's alone. The only one she's got is her fiancé. She's in the last months of the pregnancy. I don't know, women, how you would react. Would you rather stay comfortably alone at home, or would you rather be with your fiancé, knowing that the baby's about to come, even if it means there's a risk you can deliver the baby in a hotel? At least you'll be with the man you love. I don't know how you'd play that out, but I can see that maybe Mary decided she wanted to make the trip. So in none of these details so far do we have any irreconcilable differences between Luke's account and the historical records. When it comes to the kind of census or the rules that might impose, the best critics have done is to assume arguments from silence, which is very, very dangerous to do. because there are repeated similar instances throughout the 2-volume work of Luke, Acts, where the scholars and critics blamed Luke for getting something wrong, and eventually they discovered that Luke was right all along. After all, Luke depended on the eyewitnesses, and he got the details right, as far as we know, in every opportunity. Our real challenge with Luke's census is about the date when it appears to have occurred. Luke wasn't able to give us an exact date for the birth of Christ. There are other events that he pinpoints to specific years that we can coordinate with the timing of external sources. Often Luke does that by timing it with a specific year in the reign of an emperor or a local governor, in the first year of Pilate's reign, in the first year of an emperor's reign, in the 4th year of an emperor's reign. So we have to work around these dates. Let me chart this for you, just so that it's a little clearer. Let's assume that we've got the year 1. I don't know if you realize this. There wasn't a year 0, right? We went from 1 BC to 1 AD. Don't know if you realize that. There was a monk many centuries after the birth of Christ who came up with the Christian calendar. And to come up with a Christian calendar, he wanted to pinpoint the year of Christ's birth. He did some research, and unfortunately he got it wrong. Let me show you this chart, just so that we can follow along. Let's assume that we've got the year 1 AD. I think, Stevadan, we've got that. Have you got that on the PowerPoint for me? That could be my PowerPoint glitch for the day. Who knows? So he tried to pinpoint the year 1, but he didn't quite get it right. So we have to go back and sort of do some logistics backwards. We've got 3 reigns to work with. Caesar Augustus, Octavian, is the Roman emperor when Jesus is born. His reign went from 27 BC to 14 AD. There's our yellow line with the year 1. So Caesar Augustus overlaps that. He comes on the throne in 27 BC. He's there until the 19th of August, 14 AD. We know that Jesus was born somewhere in that range between 27 BC and 14 AD. We've got another date that we work with. We learn from Matthew that King Herod is on the throne when Jesus is born. But Herod dies about 3 or 4 years after the birth of Christ. We can date Herod's death to 4 BC because the text tells us that there was a spectacular eclipse that everybody noticed just after Herod died. And it was stark. They noticed it and they thought there had been an eclipse because the great king had died. But we know when that eclipse occurred. It occurred in 4 BC. Herod the Great then ruled from 37 BC to 4 BC. Jesus was born sometime during his reign, probably 3 or 4 years before his death, which means that Jesus would have been born either in 7 or 8 BC. In many ways, I guess Jesus is ahead of his time. Now, here's our problem. Quirinius is governor of Syria from 6 AD to 9 AD. So the problem is, if Quirinius ordered a census during his reign as governor of Syria, that cannot be the census that brought Jesus to Bethlehem, because Jesus was born either in 7 or 8 BC. And that is the irreconcilable apparent difference in the text. So what happened here? Did Luke make a mistake? Did he get the wrong census? Did he get the facts wrong? Well, some people have thought maybe Luke confused the 2 censuses. Maybe there was a census when Jesus was born and there was another census a little later, and Luke confused the 2 censuses. We know that's not the case because in Acts 5:37, and Luke, you remember, he writes his account, the Gospel of Luke and Acts, as one full flow of 2 volumes. Volume 1 is Luke, Volume 2 is Acts. Near the beginning of Volume 2, in Acts 5:37, Luke mentions the census that Quirinius did between 6 and 9 AD. He knew about that census. He didn't confuse the 2. And in fact, that census was a pretty nasty one. It got so nasty, in fact, that when Quirinius ordered that census in 6, he got very punitive with the Jewish people. He forced them to travel and to work on the census. He forced them to register, which they didn't like to do, and he really pushed the envelope. So much so that there was an uprising. It was led by a man called Judas of Galilee. He corralled a bunch of people together that led a local revolt against the Roman army. It ended badly. Hundreds and hundreds of them were killed, but it gave birth to a movement called the Zealots. 30 years later, during Jesus' ministry, the Zealots are still around. They had come out of that census. But because Luke mentions that later census, he knew when it happened, he knew how it had ended. That's not the census he's talking about in Luke chapter 2. So biblical scholars have proposed three options. One interesting option is that the Roman Empire wasn't quite as efficient as maybe they should have been. Is it possible, they wonder, for a census to have begun in 7 or 8 BC and to still be going on in 6 or 7 AD? Could it be possible that a census would have taken 12 or 13 years for the count? Now, before you think that's ridiculous, here in Canada, with all of our modern equipment, all of our computers, the government takes a census every 10 years. In 2001, in 2011, in 2021, in 2031, that's the routine the Canadian government is in. You need to know that as we started to prepare for the census in 2021, we were just starting to get the details in 2018 and 19 about the count that was taken in 2011. For all their computers, it's taken the Canadian government 7 or 8 years to tabulate the count and to get us the results from the 2011 census. So if in Canada, with all of our modern equipment, it's still after 7 or 8 years, we're still not quite done the count and the tabulation, is it possible that a census would have stretched out over 14 or 15 years? Possible. The second explanation is based on the fact that before Quirinius became governor in Syria, he held a couple of other positions on his way up the power structure of the Roman Empire. He didn't just suddenly become emperor in 6 AD. He'd filled other roles. He was in positions of power. You worked your way up to being governor. You did other jobs in the government. You were somebody's undersecretary. You were minister for this. You served in this cabinet. You did this. And eventually, if you did all of that well, you got to be, governor or ambassador to China or some high position like that. Strangely, when Luke refers to Quirinius in chapter 2, he doesn't use the title governor. There's a title for governor that's used repeatedly in the New Testament. In fact, in more than 20 cases where it appears, the title is stated officially as a noun. We are told that Pilate was the governor in Judea. Jesus told the disciples that they would be persecuted and they would be brought before the kings and the governors. Several times as Luke and Paul travel together in the book of Acts, they come to a new city, they come into a new province, and they rub shoulders with the governor. But in Luke 2, the Greek doesn't say that Quirinius was the governor. It simply says that he was governing. It doesn't say that the census happened while Quirinius was the governor of Syria. It says that it occurred while he was governing in Syria, which could refer to any number of other local positions which he might have held in the structure on his way up to becoming the governor. It's strange that Luke won't use the official title in the noun form as he does so readily in other places. So the fact that Luke doesn't use the official title of governor, the fact that he says this was the first census, not the second one that he mentions in Acts, all of this suggests it's very likely, very possible in fact, that there was an earlier census, one in which Quirinius was involved, not as the governor, but as part of the power structure. That explanation is a little more going for it, but there's a third possibility that's more of a grammatical issue. The structure of the Greek phrase, the order of the words, literally says this census was the first while Quirinius was governor of Syria. And that word that's translated first speaks to chronology of events. Sometimes it's translated as before. Something happens first before something else. It is possible that what the Greek says is that this was a census that happened first before Quirinius was governor of Syria. It's a very possible way to read the Greek, and many do. For several reasons, I think this final option is the most direct, the most elegant, and it leaves the fewest loose ends. So the fact is that, yes, at first glance, when we read the text, there appears to be a contradiction, but it's not insurmountable. Given Luke's impressive track record with the rest of his chronology throughout Luke and Acts, my sense is that, as has often happened already with other texts where we had questions long ago, Luke will eventually turn out to have had some insights that historians didn't have. And when we compare the writings of other historians to Luke with a critical eye, there's one thing you have to remember. Tacitus, Josephus, all of the historians, all of the Greek and Roman historians were not working with eyewitness accounts. They were working with second-hand, third-hand, fourth-hand records that they were putting together to piece their history together. Luke insists that he's working with direct eyewitness accounts. So the point is that we can actually look at the text of Luke together with solid confidence that what we're reading is the events the way they occurred as they were told to Luke by the eyewitnesses who were there. Let's go back to Luke chapter 2. Let's read all of our 7 verses this morning. Luke chapter 2, verses 1 to 7. In those days, a decree went out from Caesar Augustus that all the world should be registered. This was the first registration before, perhaps, Quirinius was governor of Syria. And all went to be registered, each in his own town. And Joseph also went up from Galilee, from the town of Nazareth to Judea, to the city of David, which is called Bethlehem, because he was of the house and lineage of David, to be registered with Mary, his betrothed, who was with child. And while they were there, the time came for her to give birth. And she gave birth to her firstborn son, and wrapped him in swaddling clothes, and laid him in a manger, because there was no place for them in the inn. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks. At some point, when you have a chance, it would be good for you to read through the whole text of Luke in one sitting. Actually, it would be a good idea for each of the Gospels. It's easier to do that with Mark because it's a little shorter. But if you were to do that, if you were to read to Luke in one setting, you'd notice something. When we get to the beginning of Luke chapter 2, there's a kind of whiplash reaction. There's a dramatic turn of events. Luke has spent all 80 verses in the first chapter building up the introduction of Jesus Christ. So important is Jesus Christ that after 400 years of silence, when God finally breaks the silence, he sends not just an angel, he sends not other than Gabriel, the archangel, and he sends him into the holy place of the temple in the royal city of Jerusalem to bring news to respected old priest that his barren wife is about to miraculously have a child. And that very unique child, who will be filled with the Holy Spirit from the womb of his mother, will be preparing the way for someone even greater than himself. Obviously, there's somebody spectacular who's about to come on the scene. So important is the child that's to come in chapter 2 that when Gabriel appears again in quick succession to a young virgin girl to tell her that she's about to conceive a child in a way that he's never been done before through the power of God's Holy Spirit, this child is going to be something amazing. So important is the child that's going to come in chapter 2 that even in the womb he causes the Spirit-filled reaction from the prophet John the Baptist. So important is the child that's going to come in chapter 2 that in chapter 1 Mary and Zechariah quote dozens of Old Testament prophecies that refer to him far ahead of time, and they blend these into their songs of praise. So important is the child that's going to come in chapter 2 that Mary and Zechariah both make it very, very clear that they understand that this child that's going to be born, this child that little John the Baptist will introduce and point to, this child in Mary's womb will be nothing less than divine, God himself in the flesh, come to visit and rescue his people. That's quite the buildup. All the way through chapter 1, it builds and it builds and it builds and it builds. And then we finally turn the page into chapter 2 of Luke, and after 80 verses of buildup, we expect something spectacular. There's going to be lights, and the earth is going to shake, and there's going to be cameras and projectors, and there's going to be a massive choir, and there'll be a brass quartet, and they're going to sing the Hallelujah chorus, and there'll be a herald crying out in the town square that something important is about to happen, or someone important has just arrived. I don't know if you're a political junkie like me, but sometimes I still find myself listening to the State of the Union. Okay, I didn't listen to Trump's State of the Union. I apologize. I skipped those. But just before that happens, when the president walks into the House of Congress, there's this guy whose job it is to walk in, and with a loud voice he says, "Ladies and gentlemen, the President of the United States of..." And you expect that at the beginning of chapter 2. But it's not there. We flip the page into chapter 2, and suddenly Luke talks about Octavian, the Roman emperor, the one who had spectacularly managed to consolidate the power of Rome. After defeating the united forces of Antony and Cleopatra at the Battle of Actium, he was the first of the Caesars to receive the august title of emperor. We discovered an interesting inscription at Priene. It dates to 9 BC, and it says that Caesar Augustus, Octavian, was God. There's an interesting other inscription that we found at Halicarnassus. It's preserved in the British Museum. If you ever visit, it's part of a tablet that's there. It says this: Augustus is the father of his divine homeland Rome, inherited from his father Zeus, and a savior of the common folk. His foresight not only fulfilled the entreaties of all people, but surpassed them, making peace for land and sea, while cities bloom with order, harmony, and good seasons. The productivity of all things is good and at its prime. There are fond hopes for the future and goodwill during the present, which fills all men so that they ought to hear pleasing sacrifices and hymns to the great Octavian. Well, you thought that the former American president thought a lot of himself. You haven't seen anything. And then there's Quirinius, ruling over Syria. Together, Octavian and Quirinius issue decrees and directives that will impact almost a full quarter of the population on the surface of the earth. They control in the Roman Empire almost 22% of the world's population. These are decrees to which common mortals simply respond without question or hesitation. They can be conscripted by force. They pay taxes beyond reason, never questioning why. When the emperor and the governor says jump, you ask how high. But in contrast to those great powers and those great movement of people across the great span of the mighty Roman Empire, we focus in on two little villages, both of them very little, unimportant villages out of the way, off the beaten path, Nazareth and Bethlehem. We go from Rome and the great cities of power to these two little villages. And in these two obscure little towns, there's a peasant working man of apparently no great standing, and he becomes enmeshed in this flow of political history way beyond his control. And Joseph isn't even at the bottom of the pecking order. But then of all the people on the scene, the one with seemingly the least control is Mary. In this context, in the great contrast, it's hard to imagine anybody less powerful than Mary. In contrast to Caesar Augustus, who rules the world at the very whim of his voice, here is a pregnant, unwed teenager of a conquered race dominated by a foreign power. She is a nobody. And she's entirely dependent on the grace and goodwill of Joseph, who's not even her husband yet, who's still trying to figure out exactly what to do about a child that's not his. And then on this night, Mary is even powerless against her own body. At the wrong time, in the wrong place, in the wrong circumstances, in the middle of a hard trip no one would have chosen to embark on the final stages of pregnancy, on a night when they have been unable to get a hotel room, on a night when there wasn't even a decent place for them at the inn. Mary's waters break, and the baby is coming. And there's absolutely nothing she can do about it. It's time for her to give birth, and there's absolutely nothing she can do to delay it. Nothing but submit to unfolding events completely beyond her control. Luke has structured this whole little story at the beginning of chapter 2 a little bit like those stacking Russian Matryoshka dolls. They stack on one another. You start with a big one. There's the big Caesar Augustus doll. He rules the whole earth. And then under him there's a smaller doll, and that's Quirinius. And then under him there's King Herod. And then under him there's the high priest and the Sanhedrin. And then as you get really, really small, you eventually work your way down to the little Joseph doll. And then powerless is his fiancée. But you know, there's somebody in the text that is even more powerless than Mary. He's a child in the womb. And on this night, in an absolutely ordinary way, like hundreds of millions of other babies had done before him, and like billions of babies will do after him, he will pass through the messy, bloody trauma of the birth canal into a cold, smelly night in a dark stable. He'll fight for his first breath as he cries out and his lungs get their first fill, still tied to a piece of placenta until Joseph finds a blade and cuts him free. And then they tightly wrap him in swaddling cloths. This is a tradition that we fortunately dropped in our day, but the thought was that in order for a baby's little limbs to grow straight and not crooked, they needed to be tightly wound in the hours after they were born, and they needed to stay that way for a couple of weeks to make sure the legs and the arms would be straight. So they would take long pieces of cloth that they would tightly wrap around the baby, essentially making the baby a tiny little powerless prisoner. In that way, he is laid in a manger. Can you imagine anybody with less control and less power and less authority on that night than this newborn baby, tightly wrapped in swaddling cloths, laid in a manger? So uneventful and ordinary is the birth that Luke simply says, Mary gave birth to her firstborn son. No fanfare. Nothing different about this birth. At first glance, so insignificant does he appear to be, that in the text this morning, did you notice this? He is the only one whose name is not even mentioned. In chapter 1, later in chapter 2, in chapter 3, in chapter 5, his name will feature prominently, but on this night, in these 7 verses, on the night of his birth in the manger, we've got the title of Caesar, Augustus, Octavian, ruler and controller of the world, Quirinius, governor of Syria. Joseph is mentioned, Mary is mentioned. So powerless is he on this night. So totally and completely has he relinquished control as he steps into the manger, that his name is not even mentioned. He is an unknown infant, wrapped and laid in a manger. The one who is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation, the one by whom all things were created, all things in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, the one who created thrones, dominions, rulers, and authorities. Not only were all things created through him, not only were they created by him, they were created for him. The one who is before all things, the one in whom all things hold together, the one who holds the universe together by the word of his power, the one in whom all the fullness of God was pleased to dwell. That one. Mary gave birth to her firstborn son. She wrapped him in swaddling cloths and laid him in a manger. In their well-known song, Lee Rufus Green and Mark Allen Lowry make this point by asking Mary a question. Mary, did you know that your baby boy would one day walk on water? Mary, did you know that your baby boy would one day save our sons and daughters? Did you know that he had come to make us new? Mary, did you know that the child you delivered would one day deliver you? Did you know that your baby boy will give sight to the blind and will calm the storm with his hand? Did you know that your baby boy has walked where angels trod? When you kiss your little baby, you kiss the face of God. Mary, did you know the blind will see, the deaf will hear, the dead will live again, the lame will leap, the dumb will speak the praises of the Lamb. Mary, did you know that your baby boy is Lord of all creation, and that he will one day rule the nations? Did you know, Mary, that your baby boy is heaven's perfect Lamb? That sleeping child you're holding is the great I am. Mary, did you know? Let's pray. Father, this morning on this Christmas Sunday, we are simply overwhelmed at the reality that our great God stepped into our world, became one of us to redeem us. Father, words fail us. We can simply say, thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Amen.